Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists today. First, we have us Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership, an organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for Americans of all faiths. We have Mr. Lawrence Brown, who's with us, who's the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of Baker Strategy Group and a University of Maryland professor of public policy. We also have with us Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Gentlemen, looking forward to having you guys with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, there's a proposed piece of legislation that has been put in place that's trying to codify the rights of Indigenous students who wear tribal regalia. This is turning out to be a bit of an issue for certain students who really want to go in and represent themselves and represent their tribes and represent their religion by way of graduation. But school officials have told some of these individuals that you're not allowed to wear anything that takes you outside the normal wearing of regalia. There have been efforts put in place to stop these students. And when you look at this in a vacuum to some degree, you may wonder, well, what is the big deal? But if students now have an opportunity to really express themselves and to put themselves in a position where others can learn about their traditions, some may wonder what's the big deal. Last year, we had a student who was forced to remove an eagle feather from her graduation cap before her ceremony. When you take a look at all these laws that have been put in place, and some would say that there are already laws that have been pretty much codifying to some degree and enough cases that have been out there to let people know that this is something that should be doable during ceremonies. But for some reason, it looks as though that question still seems to be out there. You know, Tim Schultz, tell me a little bit about this thought process. I mean, I like going to graduations, I like seeing the regalia, but it looks as though students are trying to have a little bit more of personality, and some would actually even like to celebrate, you know, where they come from, their heritage, their customs. I mean, what's the issue here, or is there an issue here, or when can you go too far?
Well, I think the issue is the non-accommodation by these school bureaucracies that are telling students who are making a very reasonable accommodation request they can't do it. We see this in a lot of areas of life. We've talked about it on this show and other contexts a lot. And I think the problem is that while these acts probably violate a state Religious Freedom Restoration Act in a state like Oklahoma that has a law like that, you really don't want to be in the position of having to litigate a case like this if you're a student, because by the time the litigation's done, your graduation ceremony is over, and you've kind of won the battle, but not the war, right? So I think that a federal law clarifying what these rights are probably would be a good idea, because I think it's really important. I think these acts are clearly illegal by these public school bureaucracies, but they're really not remediable in the time that you actually have before graduation.
You know, Andre, when you look at these type of circumstances, though, you have to wonder, should there be a line somewhere? You know, if I decide that I want to show up at graduation and I'm, you know, wearing the skin of a cow and I decide that that's something that works for me, can you go too far? How do you get to determine what the right balance is? And then who gets to make the call on what the right balance is?
Yeah, you know, so I think every summer around this time of year, we see video clips of various graduation ceremonies and students expressing their celebration and character and you know, as a Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said, you know it when you see it. When something goes over the line, and you know, there is a reverence and solemnity to graduation ceremonies. I get that. But in reading the background of this case, it seemed that the actions of these actions were the result of an overzealous school district or school administrator. Look, graduations are a time of celebration, not only of achievement, but also of family and heritage. And these aren't political or inflammatory expressions. So, this legislative session, in fact, we see three state legislatures considering bills that would protect rights of Indigenous and ethnic students in Oklahoma, Nevada, and Nebraska. And so, and I think these bills are predicted to pass overwhelmingly and will be signed by the respective governors.
You know, Sharon, I got to tell you, I'm somebody who's been on the board of regents and probably attended more graduations than I can imagine. And I went to one graduation and there was an individual who was actually burning incense getting ready to walk down the aisle. And somebody pulled that individual to the side and said, no, you can't do that. I mean, has that gone too far? Or when do we determine that, this is something that doesn't make sense? If I'm able to tell you that's part of my culture, should somebody be trying to figure out how to make that work? Or am I missing something here?
No, I think the incense burning fit Justice Stewart's, Potter Stewart's definition of "I know it when I see it." That's too far. But clearly, in this case, this is something where I agree with Andre and Tim in that the school district was overzealous in stopping this student from wearing regalia that was about their custom and their faith. And that's what we have to be, mindful of and ever vigilant, as Jefferson said, about these things. So this is one where I do think if there was a federal statute, that it could, at least put us in the right direction. Because state by state making these determinations always gets us to, where there are issues coming up. But this was overzealous on behalf of the school district.
Well, Lawrence, what do you do when you're now saying, okay, this seems to be a violation of a law that was well thought out and put into place, but somebody feels as though, but it feels okay, so let's go forward with it. If we start allowing that to be the litmus test of activities, how on earth can the student or a school district that may be just trying to follow the law be in a position to protect itself?
Yeah, that's a fast track to Looney Town. The fact is, nothing is cut and dried. Things are not static, and people have to remember that. And I'm saying that because you're always going to have one group pushing to go further than is appropriate to go, and you're always going to have another group restraining more than is appropriate to restrain. And without active engagement, without ongoing recognition of the fact that as a country, we may have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And if we're not mindful of that, it is so easy to mask biases and just blatant discrimination in the prettiest dress possible. But I don't care how pretty the dress is that you put on discrimination. It's still discrimination, and it's still ugly to the bone. And so you have to have a situation where people are willing to recognize that this is not just something that we can say whatsoever goes and however it goes, it goes. No, there's got to be an active effort on both sides to make sure that we're not straying too far to the right or too far to the left. Granted, easier said than done. It's tough work, but somebody's got to do it.
But Tim Schultz, would this be considered discrimination, if we look at it from a legal perspective?
Well, I think it would be considered a violation of some laws. They might be a violation of some state civil rights laws. It might be a violation of some federal educational access civil rights laws. And it's certainly a violation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, except that doesn't apply to the states, right? States have to have their own state RFRAs if they want that level of protection. Mm-hmm. Again, though, the problem is in these situations, you don't want to be litigating, right? You don't want to be in that position because by the time you get the result you want, it's too late. So it's really important, and I think that's part of the reason why these state proposals are good, make good sense, because they put bureaucracies on notice about what the law is in this particular situation that is actually likely to keep happening and popping up. So I think a more specific state law is probably the way to go. And if we can pass a federal law, all the better.
Well, Andre, you got 9 states that somehow, from a bipartisan standpoint, have been able to kind of put in place some regulations to make this work. But those may be 9 states that really the cultural aspect of what goes on in their state kind of makes sense. I mean, we're talking about the possibility of a federal law that would have to cut across all 50 states when you have really a small percentage of them that are even talking about this issue. You know, how do you try to get to the next level when you start to see certain number of states trying to grapple and come to some type of solution, but then the federal solution may be one that comes in more like a sledgehammer than actually like a scalpel?
Right. Yeah. And so it is a state by state, and I'll even say a culture by culture application. And I hate the over codification of laws and regulations where every little ticky tack thing is thrown into the code book. But in this case, I think you almost have to, to define and draw the line of what's acceptable, what and like I said before, there is a certain reverence and solemnity when it comes to graduation ceremonies, and I'm not talking about the church mouse kind of reverence, but it is a ceremony of celebration and of the achievement of academic. Of an academic degree, and so you do want to keep that reference, but also you want to define where the line is of, okay, this is where the line of celebration is acceptable, and to also maintain the reverence of the ceremony.
But Rashawn, who makes the difference and who makes the call regarding the line? Because there are some cultures where the line should be way over to the left and somewhere it's way over to the right. I think part of the problem that we have here is that we are looking at a society that's not tolerant of something that looks different. The reality is that if I'm going to allow this for an indigenous group of individuals, where do we go next? Especially if we talk about this from a religious perspective. Do we start to get on a slippery slope to some degree?
Well, I think that's the thing we have to be protective of, not the slippery slope as to we're letting too many people in. But anytime we get a religious ceremony that's outside of what we think as the mainstream in America, Judeo-Christian religions here, that's when we start to have that discussion about whether it's allowed or not allowed. I think this is a good case to look at to make us mindful of the fact that you want to make sure you're protecting those individuals that have a faith that's different from what we normally see. And the hard part about the federal regulation, even though I would like to see one, is that, it's hard to take it, state by state or even county by county because they're so different. I would like to end with something that Andre said, and I agree with you. I hate to see the over codification of laws. I spent my entire legislative career just voting against stuff and not putting laws in because I thought we had too many. But I think in this case, we have to be mindful, especially when we're talking about religion.
I think this is something that we've got to be very cautious of because sometimes a religious statement in one group has a completely different impact. I mean, when you think about, for example, Hindus and their faith, they have a symbol that looks like a swastika that they've been basically looking at for thousands of years, and 70 years ago, somebody else takes that same symbol and turns it into something else. And now they're in a situation where they wear something and somebody thinks they're being anti-Semitic, and they're really just celebrating their culture. So the ironies that come with this are very difficult, but these are arguments that we've got to continue to try to be balancing and move forward in the right direction. We're starting to see something interesting happen, in particular when we're looking at education organizations and how you try to find the right balance. We're seeing more and more that funding is being used to really kind of impact education at many different levels and many different kinds of institutions. Congress recently passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it was an idea that parents should be in a position to be able to make selections of what would be the best institution for their children to attend in particular those that have disabilities, and they want to make sure that they have equal educational opportunities. This federal funding was put in place for programs that are going to be across the country. And in California, there's also a parallel piece of legislation that really wants to make sure that you've got the right funding in the right places as it relates to individuals and children that are dealing with disabilities. However, there seems to be this state law that also explicitly bans parents from using that money to send their children to religious schools. And therefore, the moment that you put yourself in that type of situation, how do you end up making sure that you are not, quote unquote, being prejudicial against an institution? However, you still have federal and state funds that are coming in to deal with something that looks like it shouldn't have anything to do with church and state, but somehow there's a connection that takes place. You know, Lawrence, when you see these type of cases coming up and these type of matters, and we realize that, you know, sometimes people are just making choices because they want to make choices that feel better for themselves and maybe not even in the best interest of their kids. This piece of legislation that's trying to make clear where the funds should go, is that a problem, or have they gone too far, or what would be the right way to balance this?
Well, first of all, I understand what it is that they're trying to do or what it is that they want to do. The reality of the situation is sometimes situations like these don't lend themselves readily to cut and dried legislation, because what ends up happening is no good deed goes unpunished. Okay, so in a situation like this, where you're trying to avoid somebody doing an end run or taking unfair advantage of something designed to help one group, which inadvertently ends up helping another group. And I get it. Funds are limited. You're trying to be careful how they're spent. But at the end of the day, when you try to pass a law like this and you think you're doing something good because you're making sure that the money goes where it's supposed to go and people are not allowed to take unfair advantage, many times, especially when religion is involved, all you end up doing is creating a bigger mess. To me, the legislation could have been written differently so as not to be seen as taking a swipe at this group or that group, because the fact remains that if you have a situation where a religious school literally offers the best scenario for a disabled child, that's the goal of the legislation in the first place. So when the legislation denies the outcome that it was ultimately written to address in the first place, something's wrong.
Lawrence is exactly right. This is another case, and we talked about this in the last segment, of the legislature, solving a problem that's not a problem. This is over legislating, because the idea is that we want to make sure that those with disabilities and the parents get the best education for their children. It should not exclude any institution that doesn't violate either federal or state laws. And so this is one where overregulation now created a problem that we are looking at trying to solve, because it did something when there was not a problem there that we know of. It's very hard, when you're dealing with children with disabilities, to understand that, you want the best scenario for them. Like I said, as long as it doesn't violate state or federal law.
But Tim, one of the issues is many of these private institutions, including religious institutions, generally do not have programs in place that are specialized for students and specialized for disabilities. So therefore, this federal or state funding that's coming in place is actually, in many instances, lifting them into another level where they're now allowed to do this, as opposed to potentially taking them there and not in another institution that really has had what I would call long-term investments in that area. So to some degree, it can be looked at that you're really improving this religious school in a way that they never intended. Am I missing something here, or does that have?
No, you're right. I mean, it's in general, private schools, and that religious schools are a subset of those, are not as effective as public schools in programs addressing special needs children, especially and including kids with disabilities, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, et cetera. And I think that the point of this proposal is to keep religious schools from becoming attractive enough and efficient enough to attract students with disabilities. That's the point of the proposal. The good news is that this is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision just this last year that if you have a generally available aid program for schools that goes to private schools, you can't exclude religious schools just because they're religious. So that's the good news. You always hate to have to litigate these things, but this is a case that the law is extremely clear now. The Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision. This might have been constitutional 20 years ago under the way the Constitution was being interpreted then. But I think that the courts have now made it very clear that we're in a new world. You can't discriminate against religion.
So, Andre, how do we try to understand that balance where we're trying to ensure that funding of a public school system is probably one of the most fundamental aspects of what goes on? When I get my annual taxes, the biggest chunk that comes out of it generally is going into public education. Should I now be saying that, you know something, if you're not an individual who's utilizing this in the same form or fashion as others, should we now be thinking about those who are sending their kids to private school to be exempt in some form or fashion, or there should be some proud of what I would call litigation to discuss this? Because I've heard a lot of parents that have been reaching out asking that question.
Yeah, so this places a lot of families in a difficult position because many religious families in California don't have the ability to give their children an education that is best for them, and this law disproportionately affects lower income families. For families that want to send their children to these schools with that have needs but cannot. Yes, Tim mentioned the Supreme Court has held that public benefits that are open to private secular organizations must also be open to religious ones. And I believe that there was a Gallup poll that also showed that nearly 2/3 of Californians think that children with disabilities should be able to use federal and state funding to go to religious schools. So bottom line, religious schools should be able to participate in publicly available programs without discrimination. And religious school students should be able to participate on equal footing with those who attend non-religious schools.
But, Lawrence, although we've got this Supreme Court decision, there's usually some language in all of this activity that says that school, even being a religious school, has to have some limitations regarding exemptions, discriminations. If you don't believe this, then quote unquote, you're not eligible for the funding. We've seen this in a number of other cases. Even in the state of New York, you've got to be able to sign off that your, employee and student handbook doesn't have certain restrictions in it. When we start to now look at all of those aspects, and even the possibility of religious schools changing handbooks so that they can be in a position to receive, have we now found people who are just gaming the system as opposed to trying to be supportive of the system?
And therein lies the rub. God may be in the plan, but the devil is always in the details. And what it ultimately comes down to is, for whatever reason, there's always going to be a part of the population that's trying to one-up, trying to take unfair advantage. And listen, I get it. Our society has a lot of lawyers in it, and it's a lawyer's job to try to figure out how to make the system, work a particular way for his client. And you have a lot of would-be litigators walking around. So I get it. But the bottom line always brings us back to the fact that while there may not be an easy, clear-cut, right-line way to write this to avoid those types of dynamics that I just described, our job is always going to be to get in, grapple, do the hard work, labor with it, go over it, and try to figure out how to write things in a way that helps us to avoid those parade of horribles. We don't do it because it's easy. We do it because it's necessary. And at the end of the day, society doesn't get to just sit back and coast. If you're going to be here, it calls for active engagement. It calls for careful consideration. And that's just the price we pay for having a society that halfway makes sense.
So this is the real question. All activities impacting children should start off with what is in the best interest of the children. And many of these instances look like they're really turning into what is the best dream of a parent. You know, Andre, when you look at these circumstances, who comes back in to make sure that what's happening is still in the best interest of the children? Because that's the whole purpose of this piece of legislation.
Right, and so what is it? Who decides what's in the best interest of the children? Parents. They're the ones that understand their what level and what their needs are as far as academic needs, maybe physical needs, and so let the parents decide and have that latitude to have the choice of available resources to them, whether it be in the public school system, private school system, or parochial school system, this statute makes that ability to choose problematic.
You know, Rashawn, when I take a look at somebody like you who's been in the legislature, these are the type of things where you have parents and religious groups that come in and try to persuade, legislative leadership to move forward in this. What ends up being, the argument that makes it a sell for you to say, that's a yes, it makes sense for me? I mean, what do you have to hear in order to know that I want to really go in and really decide to codify something like this?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you said and what Andre said, and that is, what is the best interest of the student? How do we get them, with the student with differing disabilities, the best education possible? And as long as we're not discriminating against a religious institution, school that might offer those opportunities, then we want to do that, just the same way we would do with a private school. The question always become, I would add maybe one thing to what Andre said, and that is, you want the parents to decide, but the parents need to decide along with educational experts, because a lot of times the parents don't understand exactly, especially when you're dealing with children with differing ability, what exactly is in the best interest. So if this private institution or religious school offers that, you want to make sure that they're going in with the right help there.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, guys, but this is an issue that we're gonna continue to probably grapple with, because from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, parents are looking for something new. Hey, Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, it's graduation season. Thousands of students will walk the aisle to the song Pomp and Circumstance, but I can't hear that song without remembering that it was also the entrance music to the late, great Randy Macho Man Savage.
Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Since 2010, Native American enrollment in higher education has declined from 196,000 to 123,000, a 37% decline. So if a Native American, if an Indigenous student wants to graduate with an eagle feather in his cap, I say have at it.
I got to hear that. Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
I'll give this one, that one of the founders of Google went to high school in Prince George's County, Maryland.
That's a good one, Serge Brenier. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
So we all know of the Navajo code talkers of World War II. The Navajo language was initially chosen because of its complexity, but also it does not have a written form of language.
Wow. Well, gentlemen, thanks a lot. I appreciate that information today, and I hope our audience really was informed the way I was. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.